Give a round of applause for Adelle Banks, Professor Elesha Coffman, Sister Norma Pimentel, and Professor Mark Silk, as we talk about Chronicling a Changing America, RNS at 90.
Hello, hello. How are you?
Great. Is that enough excitement?
That no,
I'll
it's all
try.
right.
I'll do better.
All right, let's get the panels on. So many panels today. Our panels has to be the best panels. All right. We talked about Louis Minsky, and Elesha, I'm going to start with you. You're a resident historian. I love a good origin story, and I love a good superhero origin story. And Deb teased it, and last night we teased it. Talk to us about Louis Minsky, and specifically, he was a Jewish immigrant, but talk to us about the superhero team-up with Christians to combat, at that time, we're not talking about 2024, 1930s, rising xenophobia, white nationalism, and fear of the other.
Right. I loved that you introduced that. It took one person with more than a limited, bigoted vision to then make this person who could be othered be part of the story instead. What Deb said about Louis Minsky is about all I've been able to figure out so far. I know about his parents immigrating to London. I know about him and his sisters crossing without their parents, just them. Then there's a bit of a misty origin part. I think he went to high school in Brooklyn. I think he was trying to make soccer a thing, and he really thought American Jews would
This
be
man was
big.
way ahead of the curve.
Yeah. I'm still trying to see whether that was him or there was another Louis Minsky who also lived in Brooklyn at the same time.
Let's just give it to him.
This is really, yeah, I think I would love for him to have been making soccer a thing. He becomes a freelance journalist, and somehow he has the chutzpah and the vision to walk into this office, National Conference of Christians and Jews. It had come out of the Federal Council of Churches. This is Protestant establishment. Everett Clinchy is a Protestant churchman with multiple academic degrees. Somehow Louis Minsky is like, I see what your organization is trying to do, building brotherhood and understanding and goodwill and fighting back this ignorance and hatred. How about this newswire service? I think that will help you do what you want to do. That will help me be who I want to be. That will help protect my community here and in Europe. And it is that team up, and I'm still trying to find the archival documents. I think they might be in Minneapolis, so that's my next archival stop to try to get to the bottom of more of that mystery.
It's RNS at 100. You have 10 years to come up with that.
I know.
Piece that story.
I know. I'm on the clock.
But oftentimes they say immigrants get it done, but women also get it done. You can applaud women. It's fine. Yeah. This is a safe space. Childless cat ladies are welcome here. Thank you for that applause. There's also, we speak about the one person who has awareness, the one person who has intention, and the one person who acts. Speaking about the history of RNS, there was also, we were talking about Lillian Block. And can you tell us about journalist Lillian Block and her type of entrepreneurial spirit to do something? I remember Michelle Obama told us, do something. And it was World War II, and she saw the same problems. Fast forward 15 years. She goes, xenophobia, white nationalism, fear. She goes, I have to do something. Tell us about the remarkable story of Lillian Block and how she's so instrumental in this evolution of RNS.
I'm really enjoying learning about her. Yesterday morning, I was at her niece's home, looking through old scrapbooks and binders of congratulatory letters. Some of this is going to become part of the archive. Women's history is so often not in the archive. I'm going to make sure that these documents are there, so she's part of the story. You're seeing several pictures of her in the slides that are going through. She was from Montclair, New Jersey, and she went to NYU and Columbia, and then she was teaching journalism at NYU. It's World War II, 1943.
Can I pause you for a second? Can you go back to that last slide, if you don't mind, just real quick? She was the only woman. Look at that.
Yeah. Yes, she was. 1943, enrollment in her classes is going down because a lot of the guys are being sent overseas. Mm-hmm. She also wants to do more for the war effort. She's quoted much later in an interview saying, I just wanted to do something to stop people from killing each other. Mm-hmm. And somehow she finds a mystery. I don't know if she saw an ad, like a 3x5 card tacked up at NYU. I don't know how she ever met Louis Minsky, Everett Clinchy, all of them, but she starts at RNS in 1943. She's managing the morgue, the files. We see some of those filing cabinets. Those are all the files that are now down at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Boxes and boxes and boxes of them. She is a trained professional journalist. She is a teacher of journalists. And so she, from RNS, and there's a correspondent newsletter going out to the people who are sending RNS material that then they send out on the wire, trying to tell them, this is how you tell a good story. This is how you find the human interest that isn't just of local interest, because they're a newswire service. Their customers are other news outlets across the country, Protestant magazines, Catholic magazines, Metro dailies, a very diverse readership that they don't have a direct relationship to. What's a story that's going to be of interest, that is going to be building up the kind of country we want to live in? They never wanted to emphasize the extreme. They never wanted to emphasize the destructive. And Lillian Block, she is there as the assistant editor. Louis Minsky dies very suddenly in 1957. She takes over right away, runs it till 1979. So between the two of them, that's almost the whole first 50 years of the organization.
Let's give them a round. Let's give their memory a round of applause. I think it's fair to say know them, know us. And, you know, we talk about the outsiders because imagine a Jewish immigrant just walking up to a bunch of Christians saying, hey, 1930s, you want to talk to me? And they're like, no. And they're like, no, why don't you work with me? And he got it done. And then we talk about Lillian, a woman at that time, being a leader. And slowly but surely you realize, okay, the others are coming in. The others are doing the work, right? The quote-unquote others. And a story I have on 9/11 is the first group that reached out to us, and I remember I was on Sproul Hall, was a member of the Japanese American community. And they said, we went through this during World War II. We have a lot of history, and we'll help you out. And the second person who came out and reached out was a white woman who said, my ancestors were Irish Catholic. We went through this in the 20th century, and now we have privilege, and we'll help you out. And right then I realized, I was 20 years old, you need a multicultural coalition, what I call the Ethnic Avengers, or if you read DC Comics, the Justice League. And this whole concept of multi-faith and diversity started actually bubbling up in the American consciousness around World War II. And this is where I want to bring in Mark, our resident professor / journalist, retired professor, always a journalist. Well, first of all, I want to ask you, we were talking that Lillian Block, apparently she went to your synagogue in Montclair?
She belonged.
Oh.
I got in touch with my high school classmate, Lisa Schnitzer, who was the daughter of our rabbi. And I said, you remember Lillian Block? And she said, no, but I remember her brother, Max,
Wow.
and his family. Max was president of the synagogue for a while, I don't know how long, and the family was in the front row at high holiday services. And one of the daughters she thought she remembered was the first girl bat mitzvahed at that synagogue. So the family was definitely closely connected. Lillian Block does not seem to have been particularly religious. I find it hard to believe that she never darkened the door of the place, but that's what I know so far. I'm still on the case.
I will take belonged. I think it's very inclusive. It's still pretty remarkable, the through lines here, but you have researched how, especially, we're talking about World War II now, we're talking about Lillian takes over, and we're talking about the changing America where it just isn't just Christian America. America now comes in contact with other religions. Talk to us about this evolution and how RNS was at the forefront of informing Americans about the existence of other religious communities in America.
Well, I think one has to be a little careful about how to understand that. In the sort of post-war heyday, when the idea of religious pluralism became ingrained in the American sort of public thing, it was Protestant Catholic Jew in the name of, in the sort of title of the famous and still read book by Will Herberg, who was also a kind of non-religious Jew, very interested in religion generally. I mean, there is something going on there which is worth exploring. I think it was above all the principle of covering different religious communities more than the reality of full diversity that RNS brings to the table. I mean, I think it was terrific that you mentioned the 1965 Immigration Act, which brings in real diversity. But before then, even if you wanted to cover Muslims, you would have to look a good deal harder than you would certainly today. I also think it's important to understand that religious diversity has always been a challenge for America going back to the 19th century. Of course, then it was diversity among Protestants, and you had pan-Protestantism across a good deal of controversy, and then you had to deal with Catholics, so that the Christians themselves are tough. Also, I think I would make one other point, which is that it took quite a while, according to Elliot Wright's really quite good history of RNS. Elesha may disagree, but I think, I hope not,
It was great for the first 60 years, but I want to add on to it.
Good. It took a while for RNS to get around to Eastern Orthodox and to the traditionally black denominations. The civil rights movement kind of awakened them to that. So it's sort of like the Declaration of Independence. Wonderful principles, an understanding that's limited at the time, but the principles then force and compel and invite the kind of coverage we're seeing today.
Oh, much like America, huh? Too soon? My bad. So we are now, post-World War II, America has to confront, I think that's the good way, other people exist who aren't white, who aren't Christian, who aren't Catholic, who aren't Jewish. Okay, we have to stretch ourselves. We have to become a bit uncomfortable. We have to expand the tent. We have to meet, our actions have to meet our principles. Sometimes that works out really well. And other times, instead of expansion, it leads to constriction, right? And so we get to a point where we take the DeLorean now, and we're gonna make a leap to 1980. And 1980, can you connect the dots for us, Mark, on specifically, because I think that's a fork in the road of how religion, religious language, the concept of family values, traditions, was deliberately used, and some would say, not me, but some would say hijacked by, if you will, the right wing and associated with the right wing.
Well, let me separate those three terms you used a little bit. Religious language, one of the things that I studied for my sins is the language of Judeo-Christian terminology. That's a term that's really embraced, even though many Jews don't know this story, but liberal Protestants introduced it before, as a political term, before World War II, as a way of saying it's not just Christians here. At the height of really anti-Semitic concerns and realities on the eve of World War II, Judeo-Christian becomes the new term and a liberal term for inclusion. Obviously, it doesn't include everybody. It becomes a cliche and falls somewhat out of favor among progressives and is seized on by Jerry Falwell at the end of the 1970s and becomes now code language for conservative Christian understandings of this tradition. So there it was a sort of seizure of that. In terms of family values, I looked up the very useful Google Ngram incidence of that term. It increases 900% between 1980 and 1998. Wow. So that's a term which is essentially invented by the religious right as their banner. And maybe there's an article to be written about that. So there's that. But then there's the reality of how religion becomes the sort of marker of conservative American politics, and particularly Republican ones. I've argued, I will argue, that conservatives in America, including operators for the Republican Party, I mean, people thinking about how to go forward, with a Sun Belt strategy that comes out of the Nixon administration, and understanding that overt racism is not going to work anymore, see an opportunity in conservative religion and the concerns of religious conservatives about the social changes that have taken place with respect to equal rights for women, the ERA, and specifically gay rights, and with Roe v. Wade, certainly by the end of the 70s, becoming salient. And so religion becomes a marker for political activism. And you have the very interesting moment when Jerry Falwell says, you know, those people never criticized us, the media never criticized us, the left never criticized Martin Luther King Jr. for mixing religion and politics. Of course, Jerry Falwell's folks did. He said, but now they criticize me for doing it. And he said that before there was any criticism of him. So he knew what he was doing. He knew how to advance the cause. And I think at that point, particularly in the wake of real dissension after the civil rights movement, the religious folks on the left tried to get their act together for the anti-war movement, much less successfully. And so religion as a force on the progressive side had subsided, and there was an opening on the right.
And you fast forward 44 years, here we are in 2024, there's going to be a presidential debate, and as Deb said, we're not really living in unprecedented times. This is a reboot. But we're speaking about, you know, religion as a force of progress, as a force of movement for the civil rights. You know, Adele, I always, because I'm gonna make a confession here. I'm a practicing Muslim. No pork, no pork. No alcohol, no alcohol. You're one of those, I'm one of those. And when people hear that, Adele, they're like, oh, like liberals go, oh, like, but you were talking about poetry and you know about world affairs and you seem so moderate. I'm like, we exist, yes. Oftentimes when people talk about religion or religious people, I always joke, they think we're either carnivores or like hardcore vegans. And most of us are omnivores, right? Some people are religious, but they don't practice. Some people fast only during Ramadan. You know, it's messy. And that's how religion plays out in the American landscape. And so, as Mark was saying, you know, oftentimes religion is associated with the right wing, and oftentimes, especially how it's used and employed by the GOP, has led to negative perception of religiosity. But you've been covering how religion has been a vehicle of force and inspiration for progress, for social justice. And you've also covered how religion has been a source of bigotry and pain and rage and sadness. Can you give us a salient example of the former? Let's start out with some good news, where religion is one of the animating forces that brings out a multicultural coalition, what I call the ethnic Avengers, to push America to meet its principles.
I just want to thank everybody for being here first. It's just very exciting to see us all celebrating RNS together. It's just very cool. Thank you for letting me start with the supposed brighter side, I guess. For social justice is one issue that has brought together lots of different religious groups. And the Black church that I cover a lot is one of the main aspects of that, has been one of the main forces of that. And so there are historically Black denominations that exist because of some of the history we've already talked about. And I've been covering several of them over the past couple of months because it's that season. And almost everyone brought up the need to vote and the importance of still working for the rights of African Americans and therefore everybody else. But as we said, this isn't brand new. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the civil rights movement, that was their cause, to try to better people, to give people rights they didn't have. And when those rights occurred, it lifted all boats, as they say. And so that helped all Americans. So that has not changed. And the new wrinkle of that is there are now more multicultural and multi-religious efforts to help with voting and the pending election. There's a group called Faiths United to Save Democracy that is rooted in Black church leaders who were doing souls to the polls and that kind of thing. Now they're embracing all kinds of people of different faiths, as well as people of no faith, as well as people involved in secular organizations like labor unions, and all of them are working together not only to get people to register, but also to get people to the polls, and to also have people they call either poll chaplains if they are clergy, or peacekeepers if they're not, to help reduce what they anticipate might be escalation at the polls. In previous years, there's been battles between, a Republican or a Democrat coming out and making assumptions about each other, and somebody need to be there to cool things down. And so they are building a force for that.
And speaking about the messiness, what we're witnessing, just the stories that have come out in the past month, we've seen evangelicals against Trump. We're seeing Latino evangelicals for Trump. We're seeing Muslims, on edge, uncommitted. You're seeing a messiness that is there that oftentimes, I think if you come from these religious communities, this makes sense. But oftentimes it isn't reported as such. And the story that really takes hold is, as Mark kind of gave us the history, was religion as not just as a shield, but as a sword, as being used predominantly, but not exclusively from, if you will, the right wing, as a restrictive force, right, against the expansion that you're talking about. What's a story recently that you've covered where you see that religion being used as a sword at this particular moment?
Well, I think that the way that a lot of different religions have come together has been on a topic that we haven't discussed too much yet and will probably, is abuse, sexual abuse. It's kind of one thing that people think, oh, it's the Catholic Church, or now then they think, oh, it's the Southern Baptist. But just like all the other things we're talking about here, it's a lot of different faiths. There's Buddhists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, and you can go down the line that has also been an issue. And so that's been a challenge, that people look at religion and, in fact, leave religion because of that. There's a stat that I had from PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, that said 31% of the religiously unaffiliated Americans say they no longer identify with their childhood religions because of the clergy sexual abuse scandals.
And speaking about that, oftentimes I can tell you from also Muslims, believe it or not, have these issues. Oftentimes it is reporters and journalists who have been the major catalysts of dealing with people who have the courage to come out, oftentimes women, and tell the story. So it is a story, but how do you come out and tell that story? A lot of landmines. But you talked about people who are leaving religion. And you said it was 31% who have left because of sexual abuse. And you're talking about the rise of nuns, not nuns. This is a safe space for nuns. But we're talking about NONES. And speaking about religious diversity, as we had the branching out of religious diversity after World War II, now we have to keep expanding it. And we have to talk about nuns. Because, especially when we talk about Gen Z, the nuns are a thing. They are rising, they're not going away. These are individuals who are rejecting or saying, we don't want organized religion, we don't want the labels. But if you talk to them, they're very spiritual, they're looking. What's a story about nuns that you think has not been covered properly? What is it that we're missing about the rise of the nuns?
One piece of it is that people think that the word nuns means none, and it doesn't necessarily. People who are not particularly affiliated, they may be atheists, they may be agnostics, but they also are very spiritual in many cases. I talked to one author recently who was concentrating on the Black church, and he said that a great number of them still go to church, sometimes go to church monthly, definitely believe in God. They just don't want to be part of the institutional aspect of religion. So that's part of it. My colleague Catherine Post has done some reporting where she went to Atlanta and also Tucson, and I'm forgetting the third one right this minute. Tell me what it is, Catherine. And Miami, that's it. And so in these instances, people are still meeting in buildings that were used as churches, but they're lighting candles. They're not necessarily having communion in the way you would normally think of having communion. And there's a movement there of nuns where they still want to congregate, interestingly. They don't want to leave all of that behind. Then there's the spiritual people who don't go anywhere near a building and maybe ride a bike or go for a walk because they see their spirituality that way. And our social media team has told us that people are most interested, very interested in our stories about the people who are spiritual but not religious. So that means we have to keep writing about them, figure out how. I don't know if start riding a bike next to some of them or to follow them, because that is a challenge for us. How do you cover people who express themselves spiritually without being in a building you can go to on a Sunday morning? So it's a challenge for us, but it's one that we obviously can't give up on.
So it's inspired me to just ask all of you before I ask Sister Norma a question, especially as writers and journalists, as historians. When, because the concept of religion is so fluid now and changing, for some people for better and worse, they would say, right? They're like, spiritual, not religious. What does that mean? That's nonsense. Pick a side, right? But it doesn't matter. This is where people are. You have to meet people where they are. As reporters, as journalists, when you get a story, we're like, this is the church of the force. where they're Jedis. You know, do you sit there and go, I have to cover this, or you go, bah, or you say, oh, here's a soul cycle, right? Where do you draw the line before, you know, I have to treat this emerging community, because that's what it is, with a type of similar reverence that I do, say, the heavyweights, the old guards, you know, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists. And when do you sit there and go, this is just a cultural quirk? I'm just very curious, is there a dividing line for you? Do you, because it's a subjective call. Because someone might say, well, what's wrong with my soul cycle cult? You have a cult. I love my soul cycle. We have a community, and we're very spiritual. I find more spirituality in my soul cycle group than I do at a church. How do you all make that differentiation? What to cover, what to ignore, when it comes to these emerging nuns and miscellaneous groups? I know I did a left field question.
Let me speak into the mic. I think one of the ways to understand or that I would understand that question is to differentiate between covering a group and covering a story. And journalists generally are interested in stories. And one of the problems of covering any group is that story types tend to govern what you cover. So that, for example, with new religious movements, and we're sort of in that territory here with spiritual but not religious, the default mode tends to be, is this an abusive group? Is this a bad cult, in other words? And my argument against that is, well, maybe there's some other stories to do besides, because an awful lot of the coverage then will be, there'll be some report that there's a bad cult out there. Somebody will go and investigate. Most of the time, it won't be a bad cult. And they'll come back and say, no story. But maybe there's a story. And as an example, I would say, and this goes back quite a long time when I was a newspaper man, I said, I want to do a story about a group, some Scientologists, because they claim they're a religion. My only criterion is it can't be a family or people who work for the church, just ordinary Scientologists. And sooner or later, I found one, and it was an interesting story. And the story itself was non-controversial because I made clear that a lot of people have problems with those. I think the challenge with these groups is to find decent stories, not to say I've got to do this group. But there are a lot of stories out there.
Some of it is also just including groups. Maybe you don't write a story completely about the quote-unquote nuns, but you include them in it. And even when you write about the faith-based office of the White House, for instance, they say it's not just for people of faith, but people of no faith. They're just being able to report about that acknowledgement of the wide breadth of belief is part of it.
But it wasn't for a long time with RNS. Early on, RNS was very committed to only covering what they determined were major stories of major religious groups. They did not want to talk about small groups. They did not want to talk about anything that they considered extremist or fringe, both because of what NCCJ and RNS saw as their mission of building up society through building up religion, and because there wasn't as much of a business interest for it, because RNS, their customers were the editors of these other periodicals who could decide whether to run their stories or not. And the editor of some Lutheran magazine in the Central Plains did not want a story about some group that nobody there were no members of that group there. They were never going to encounter anyone there. So what you get in the early decades is not this challenge, how do we cover something that seems extreme in a responsible way? They were, as Lillian Block put it to the correspondents, we're here to make the important interesting, which is a somewhat different challenge than selling the interesting to people who just didn't know about it before.
And that is interesting. Who decides what is important, right? I have a question for the only person here who is not a journalist or a historian, but the person who is living the faith and doing the work, and often is the subject of the stories, oftentimes the subject of journalists. We have Sister Norma, you're going to hear from her in a bit. She's going to give a talk, but I want to ask a question before you give your talk, Sister Norma. Your work deals with immigrants, undocumented immigrants at the border. And we have an election coming up. And I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that immigration will be talked about in today's debate. And I'm going to go out on another limb and say when immigration is talked about, it's going to be talked purely from the lens of national security. I don't know why. I'm just throwing it out there. I feel crazy today. What is the religious aspect of immigration, the religious story that is often missing, that you wish people talked about?
Thank you, Wash. Thank you, everybody. The side that I see, that I live out, and that I am part of, is the fact that every person matters, that every human being is a blessing. You know, it's truly a sacred presence of God. And so we must protect, we must uphold, and we must bring forward in the best way possible. And so my presence in the border is really trying to make sure that every person that has journeyed from so far away encounter themselves in a space where they are welcome, where their dignity is restored, because they have been destroyed in so many ways. And so that part of who we are as human beings, you know, whether we're with a faith or a religion or not, that part defines us as a person that connects us one to everybody. And so when we're able to connect myself with the other person that is before me, and recognize that immigrants truly are people just like us, you know, and that we cannot lose sight of that fact, you know, that yes, it's important to enforce the border and protect and know who enters our country, but we cannot lose sight of the other side of the coin, which is humanity. And we must know how to respect humanity because it's us.
With your beautiful words about humanity, I have to remind folks that just yesterday, there was fake news trending about Haitian immigrants. And a vice presidential candidate, I won't name which one, guess, posted a fake news and a lie about Haitian immigrants that dehumanized them. I won't repeat the lie. And another person who's running for president, I won't name them, we have to be bipartisan, just guess, has a plan for undocumented immigrants, which he promised would be a bloody story. And that also is a part of the American story, the beauty of humanizing undocumented immigrants and then others who flatten them. I actually have a little bit, how you all doing? You all good? Yeah, all right. This is the first panel. I know. Don't fall asleep yet. It's okay. We went 90 years and 30 minutes. I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to use it. Most newspapers now are down to having one reporter cover religion. All right? 1 or 2. Oh, 0. My bad. You know, medicine, law, and business are still out. Your pitch in the 2 minutes that we have left, the pitch, especially with the debate coming out today, why newspapers, magazines, cable news should invest in a team, or for the love of God, at least one reporter who covers religion. Elevator pitch.
Religion is everywhere. I'd like to say it's religion and fill in the blank. You have a music story, religion in music, religion in politics, religion in the environment. Just think about all the ways that you can see how religion is an angle, and it should be covered.
I think it's an impossible ask, given where newspapers are today in most cases. There are no more beat reporters for education, for anything except crime, and to some degree politics. I think the model has to be to look for disinterested, that is, objective coverage that's nonpartisan in some other contexts. And there, you know, I think what makes RNS, in a way that it wasn't, you know, 30 years ago, there were literally hundreds of full-time religion reporters and faith and values sections all over the country. At this point, the amount of actual sort of news coverage of religion stories is minuscule. And I think one can't cover up that ugly fact. How that's remedied even by, a dedicated organization like this, I don't know. It's a real challenge.
That's the next conference, Deb. Well, we've got 90 years done in 34 minutes. We actually finished on time. Give it up to our panel. We have Professor Elesha Coffman, Adelle Banks, Professor Mark Silk,